Okay, hopefully we're back online now. Oh, sorry about that. The amazing NBN decided that it's not a good time to clay, apparently. Right, so I will just start my whole speech over because I don't know how much of it actually got broadcast and how much of it I was just rambling to no one. So this is not the complete project. This is not what the end result will look like. We're looking for something like this. So this is these are some that I sort of made up until this point, because it takes a little while for either the ink or the paint to dry. So having it, you know, pre-made just means less waiting time for those of you watching. Hopefully I can get to show you how to do both, but if we only have time for or patience for one of the two options, just know that the other one is there for you. So this one was done made using a variety of alcohol inks. So you can see it's quite pretty, but it's also a little bit faded. You can see here the colors aren't as bold or as bright as they might have been when I started, simply because the ink pigments gets absorbed into the clay, and so, you know, it sort of tends to fade. This one was made with acrylic paints, so it has its drawbacks as well, so it depends on what kind of project you want to do. So this one, if the paint is on too thick, for example, it will be really hard to cut through because it's like a thin skin of plastic. So you need to be mindful of that as well when you're using acrylic inks. So I'm just going to move these off to the side. Some of the other things that we'll need is clay, obviously, seeing as this is polymer clay projects. Acrylic paint, it really doesn't matter like what kind of paint you use. As you can see, I have sort of, I look at the colors rather than the paint. I'm not too fussy about the type of paint. I'm sure there is some sort of difference, but I haven't found there to be much of a difference, pretty much at all. So there's that. And then I've got some alcohol inks here as well. Again, I've got the Pinata range, which I love the gold in this, which is why I'm using it. And I have some of these, oh, what are these? These are the Tim Holtz ones. I'm not sure what part of his brand this one is from, but anyway, there's that. Adnorak, I don't know. And then my new favorite, the iron lac inks, which are amazing. So I don't really think there's anything else we need to discuss for the time being. So let's get stuck into it. The clay that we'll need is the white and the black in Premo, and then we'll need some translucent as well. So let's get started. These are some more examples. So it's this one, this paler side of my little earrings here. That is this technique here. So this paler one here, and then this one, it's the darker one, and then this one is the darker one as well. So I'm just going to put these off to the side. Sorry, my husband's trying to sort out the NBN in the background there, so hopefully that goes well. So let me see. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is this, especially with the alcohol inks, you need to use it sort of straight away, because you can see this, the pigments and the colors has sort of seeped right in all through and made this very meh. So this was really bright. It's actually the one that I used here. So you can see there's like no white left in this at all, and it's all just sort of the same shade of pink throughout. So yeah, you need to use it and bake it sort of sooner rather than later. Okay, so I'm just going to put this off to the side. And with the alcohol ink, it's obviously a little bit faster. Like it soaks into the clay, it gets absorbed into the clay a little bit quicker. So the first thing we'll need is some clay. So if I can find it on my table here. Some white and some black. I'm sure that you could use just two contrasting colors, but white and black really give you the best effect. And so if we look at this example, you can see tiny bits of black poking through there, and that's really the only black that you'll see for this.
So the wife is currently using
it just hang on a sec. It just comes through a little bit and gives you a bit more definition in the end result. So there's that. Okie dokie. So white and black. I feel like I'm rambling a bit today, sorry. So I'm going to make a sheet of clay on a fairly thin setting, a very thick setting, sorry. One sheet of white and one sheet of black, and then we'll layer them on top of each other. So I've got my trusty little square cutter again. You don't have to use a cutter, you don't even have to use a square, you don't, you know, it's pretty free flow. You can use whatever you have lying around, or you can just have a giant slab of clay that isn't any uniform or regular shape. You know, it's entirely up to you. That was done. Put that way around. And now I've got some residue from my pasta machine, so that's amazing. Okay, let's just wipe this off here. Right, so easy peasy. I'm just going to cut this out. Okie dokie. That's that for the white. Bring in some black. Oh dear. I might have to open a new one, I think. So, like I said, this is a fairly thick setting. It's a number 3 on my pasta machine, but you can do it quite thin if you wanted to. Like I say quite often, there really are no rules when it comes to art. You do what you want, and certainly don't have to follow my advice. You can find something that works for you and go with that. This is just the way that I do it. Right, so I'm just going to put these out of the way. Where is that container? Okie dokie. So, I really hope that this is streaming properly. If it isn't, please leave me a comment. Either on social media or on the stream itself, and hopefully I can get this sorted.
You want to know how many times it dropped out today?
Alright, sorry, my husband just got off the phone with the NBN people, and frustrating is the word that I would use. Right, so I've layered my two little squares here. Thanks, Jade. Hopefully it will stay stable and fine. So I've layered my two squares here, and I'm just going to run this through the pasta machine for a final time. I'm actually going to make this a bit thinner because it's a bit thick for my liking. So, okay, so this is on a 5 setting, which is about half the halfway. Okay, let me start that sentence again. It's about a medium thickness on my pasta machine, so 1 being the thickest and 9 being the thinnest. So this one is on 5. And I'm actually going to cut this in half, of course, because I'm going to be using 2 different techniques today. But you can, you know, use the whole thing for your one project. So I think we'll actually start with the paint. And so I'm just going to put this on here. Okay, so like I was saying with the acrylic paints, there really is no not that I have found any drawbacks to using the cheap ones. So I have got a selection of blue and teal colors here, some glittery ones, some metallic ones, and then just some straight up glitter. I also like to use some iridescent paint, but I don't have any today. Well, I do, but it's, you know, all the way over there on the table across the room, so we won't use that. Okay, and it really doesn't matter in which order you start with these colors or anything like that. It's simply a matter of painting dots. So I've just got a fairly abused paintbrush over here, and this is just water to rinse my brush, and I'm just going to start by making dots in every color until the entire surface of my clay is covered. So I've run out of space. Move these out the way. Okay, I think we'll start with this metallic Montmartre metallic blue. Okie dokie. So I actually generally just use my table. Today I think I'll use a little coaster as a palette because it's easier to clean up. So I'm just gonna squeeze a bit of the paint onto this. And making dots. So when you're using the acrylic paint, you need to be mindful of the thickness of the paint. Not only because it takes longer to dry if it's much thicker, but also because when you try and cut through it, if it's really thick, it can be quite hard, and it can make things a little bit tricky when you try and cut through a really thick bit of acrylic paint, because our cutters for the most part aren't sharp enough to do that. Not cleanly anyway. It will. So what ends up happening is your clay drags and makes these awful smushy bits in the clay. Okay. So as you can see, I'm just randomly putting dots wherever I feel it needs one, and I'm hoping to achieve a fairly even spattering of all of my different shades of blue. Oh, great. Didn't shake that enough. It's better. So I have tried using a few different things for this technique. I tried mica powders, I've tried obviously the alcohol inks and the acrylic paint, and I don't really think there's anything that you can't use as long as you're able to tint the clay with it. But I will say that the mica powders, you have to use quite a bit to achieve any sort of covering, and so it can very quickly become difficult because it just looks faded and meh. So okay, so I don't actually want to cover all of the white, just because then suddenly this will be a very dark project. If you wanted to cover all of the white or even tint the background with, you know, do this on a blue clay, for example, that would be absolutely fine. But personally, I prefer the white. Oh, I've run out of colors. Is this the one I used? Yep. Oopsies. Okay, get a bit of green in there. So like I said, this takes quite a while to dry, so we might not be able to use this one today. And if we can't, I will most likely end up using it either on Friday, Saturday or Sunday's projects. Okay, and then the only thing I will say when you're doing this sort of technique is if you are using glitter planes, and I mean, why wouldn't you? Glitter is awesome. Just use those ones right at the end. So this is the first of my glitter paints that I'm going to use. The only reason I say use it last is because the other colors are generally a bit more opaque, and so they will cover the glitter, and that would be sacrilege. So it doesn't matter if your dots overlap, it doesn't, like I said, there's no rules. Just do what makes you happy. Okay, this is starting to look quite nice. So I've got 2 more paints to go. Oopsies. That. Okay, and when I'm done with this, I'm just going to actually set this aside to dry. And then the last one will be the opalescent one. Sometimes, because this is such a well, it's opalescent, so it's really see-through, and it's just got some tiny little sparkles throughout. I sometimes, once this is dry, I will just paint the whole thing with a covering of that sparkly glitter. But I'm not going to do that today. Okay, so that's the paint one, and that really is all there is to it. And so I'll just actually set this one to the side, and hopefully it will dry soonish. Because this clay is raw, you really don't want to use something like a hair dryer or you know, an embossing gun or anything like that you would usually use to dry acrylic paint with, just because the heat of that will actually end up curing the clay, which wouldn't be advisable, not at this stage anyway. Okay, so I think we'll move on to the acrylic inks now, and it's basically very much the same thing, only instead of using inks, instead of using paint, I'll use the inks. So once again, this is just a smaller paintbrush, my very advanced paint palette off to the side. And this is actually a trick that I picked up from the extremely talented Debbie Crothers. She is a polymer clay artist here in Australia, and she does a lot of alcohol ink work, and she also uses an ice cube tray to put her inks in. So, because, you know, if they dry out in this, that's fine. You can just add a drop or two of pure isopropyl alcohol to it, and it will be ready to go again. So I've started off with Pinata's Sapphire Blue, which is a really beautiful dark blue. And of course, with alcohol inks, you can sort of water the colors down a bit.
Christ, cunts. Do you want to fucking sort this shit out and fucking play the game?
So this brush is quite bristly, so it's making some really cool effects there. I just need some. So this is just actually some straight alcohol, just so I can sort of clean up my brush a bit. And now I'll use this, I think it's called Baja Blue, although I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, and if I am, I'm sorry. It's just a paler shade of blue. Oopsies. Okey-dokey. And this is Cloudy Blue, which is a... Oh, I think these are Ranger inks, I'm not sure. Oh, came in a pack, and it just says alcohol ink on the bottle there, so, you know. I probably did this in reverse order. Probably should have started with the paler colors first, but she'll be right. With the paint, it didn't matter too much if the spots touched. Just be mindful that if the ink is still wet when you're using alcohol inks, if they touch, they will mix, which is fine if that's what you're going for, but if not, then just wait for it to dry a little bit first, and then they won't mix. I mean, they'll still probably mix, but just not as much. I'm going to move on to my iron lac inks, and these inks are they're amazing. They're a bit, I find them to be a bit more vibrant, so the colors are a lot more intense, and they take a little bit longer to dry than the Ranger inks or the Pinata inks. So this one is, I think, cyan, which is written over here, teeny tiny so you can't see it. The ink does dry fairly quickly, Jade, but it has some working time, and if you found that it dried too quickly, just make sure you don't have a fan on or anything like that. And also, if it dries, you can just add some isopropyl alcohol and it will, you know, it will come back to life. And then this is the other iron lac ink, which is dark blue. The only drawback to the iron lac inks is that their range is very, very small in just the ink. I think there's only like 8 colors. Okey-dokey. Rinse that off. Oh wait. And then I think it needs some purple. So yeah, this is just iron lac's purple ink. Oopsies. It's a bit much. Never mind. Oh dear. So this purple is ridiculously dark, so I'm just adding some isopropyl to my little palette here. I'll just lighten it up. Okie dokie. That's looking pretty cool, I think. This dark purple spot here. Okay. And then the last color that I'll put on here is, I won't use this brush because it's covered in blue, is my favorite rich gold from the Pinata range. So, shake it up. Excuse me. And I'm actually using a new brush so that I don't get blue in the gold for the time being. And I'm just going to put a few dots throughout. Okay, I think that is quite beautiful. So, the ink does dry fairly quickly, but depending on how thickly you painted your acrylic, they can have kind of a similar drying time. You know, and it also would depend on the humidity in the room, and you know, whether you've got a fan blowing on it or whether you've got it just sitting in a warm room. You know, then obviously it won't. It will just affect the drying time. So I would recommend, if you are using either of these methods, to just wait at least an hour or two before you use it, just to make sure that everything is settled. the iron lac inks, because they're a bit more concentrated color wise, and they're I find that they can stay tacky for a while, and if they are tacky still, I mean, there are a couple of things that you can do if you were in a bit of a rush and you didn't want to wait for it, but yeah, I'd say that the ink dries a little bit faster. Okay, so this one has actually been sitting for about 2-3 days maybe. So it is absolutely completely dry. And this one I've painted quite thickly, so that I can show you what I mean with the paint, how it can, if your cutter isn't sharp enough, how it can make indents in the clay. So the first thing that we need to do once this is all dry is grab some translucent clay. So once again, Premo. And I'm just going to, sorry Jade, I hope that answered your question. I feel like I was rambling a bit and not making much sense. I will just cut some of this. Now what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to cover this to protect my surface technique here, or surface treatment, just a tiny little bit. So this is especially important for the inks because they can stay tacky for a while, and they can also you know, come off on your pasta machine or on your hands and spread and make a mess. So I'm just actually going to get as thin a sheet as possible of my what do you call this, translucent clay, and then hopefully we can move on. Okay. Right. So the reason you want to make your translucent clay as thin as possible is so that it doesn't... Aw, thanks Jade. She just said I'm an excellent teacher. How lovely. The reason you want to make your translucent clay as thin as possible is because you don't want it to interfere with what you've done with either the paint or the acrylics, the paint or the ink. So if you have it really, really thick, then your sort of colors won't come through as nicely or as boldly as they might be before you put the translucent clay over the top. So I'm just trying to get a sheet that's the right size here. Okie dokie. So start over here, and I actually start on one side and just little by little press this down onto the top of the pink paint, so that I reduce the risk of trapping air, oopsies, and also make sure that it sticks everywhere properly. So let me turn this so you can see what I'm doing. Oh, great. There we go. So as you can see, even though this is on my absolutely thinnest setting on my pasta machine, it's still quite, you know, it has quite an effect on the clay.
not be a bunch of fucking idiots every day of the fucking week.
Okey-dokey, this takes some time, but it's worth it. Didn't quite make it all the way to the end, so I'm just going to steal a bit from here. Oopsies. Try and not overlap it too much, at least. There you go. Some over here. Some over here. Okay, I'm just going to trim off this excess on the sides. Oopsies. Okie dokie. So this is what we have now, and this is really, really thick, so I don't really want to work with such a thick sheet of clay, especially when we're making a veneer. And so I will run this through the pasta machine, starting on about a 5, which is where it started off as, and then make it thinner as I go. Doing this will also obviously stretch it out. As you can see, it's much longer now, but it will also make sure that the translucent clay is thinner over the top. So this is on a 5 or a 6, I don't know, somewhere around there. I think it's a 6. And I'm actually quite happy with it. I think this is thin enough. So this is, well, I mean, I guess depends on your viewpoint, but this is either the really fun part or the really tedious part. You're literally going to tear this up, and it doesn't matter how neatly you tear it or how carefully you tear it or anything like that. Just because we've got acrylic paint, where you want the tear to be, hold it so that you tear the acrylic paint along with the clay, otherwise it can separate and destroy what you're trying to achieve. Okay. So I'm going to continue doing this, and it might get a bit boring to watch, but basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to tear it up and then I'm going to stick them back together. So, but I want to try and make sure that I don't have a concentration of the same colors in a single spot. So I want to, this particular color selection is a range of pinks and purples, and so I want to make sure that I get them sort of a pink one and then a purple one and then a pink one and then a dark purple one or a light purple one, blah blah blah. Once again, there's no sort of rules. If you want all the pinks concentrated in one spot, then, you know, as long as you're happy with it. And I'm just going to keep building this until I've used up my entire sheet. I'm just actually going to roll this out a little bit so you can see what we're achieving. so now because we've got the two layers of clay, a layer of white and a layer of black, when you roll it out, some of the clay that's in the back will squish out underneath the paint, and so you get this shredded looking thing. I don't know what to call it, but it's pretty and I like it. So there's that. You can also of course do a much more controlled version, which is what I'll show you with the acrylic ink, although I'm not a big fan of it, mainly because I like chaos, I guess. But it can be very pretty if you have, you know, if you do it nicely. So, I mean, you can keep adding to this or you can stop at any point. But like I said earlier, you want to use this bit and, you know, bake it sort of sooner rather than late. I wouldn't recommend leaving it for longer than, I want to say, a month, maybe 2, because the pigments in your paint will actually get absorbed into all of the clay and it would become like this rather than something bright. Okay, so that was that one. I will put this aside and I will probably end up playing with this in my part 2 video for today. But for the instructional part, I think we'll leave it at that. Okay, so I'll use my ink one next. So again, I did this one at the same time as I did this one, so a couple of days ago. And this one was done with pretty much the same brands of inks that I used today, the Lilac, the Pinata, and the, although I don't think I used this one, or this brand anyway. Yeah, so shades of orange and green. Okay, I can't recall, it was a couple of days ago. So again, I want to grab some translucent clay and just pop that over the top. Okay, and for this next part, you'll want some really small graduated cutters. So I think I'll be using circles today because for some reason lately I'm a bit obsessed with circles. So let me grab a sheet. Okay, and again, I want to try and make this as thin as possible, so that my colors don't get too muted. So again, I want to try and minimize the amount of air bubbles that I get in there. I mean, if you do get air stuck in there, it's not a train smash, like you can sort it. Just poke a hole in the clay with, you know, like a needle or something, and just push the air out. But, you know, a problem avoided. So, I mean, you saw how much rolling and squishing happened before we reached this. So don't worry about leaving fingerprints, or even if you press a little bit harder in one spot than you did in another, because you're going to be running this through the pasta machine at least once, and then you're going to be, you know, rolling it out after you've torn it up or shredded it or whatever as well. So no worries. Just one other thing that you need to pay attention to when you're doing your dots is the size of them. So sometimes I like them to be quite long, like quite streaky, and other times I make them quite small because we run it through the pasta machine after putting on the translucent clay at the end. It thins out and it stretches my spots. So these were quite small when it started, similar to these ones here, and now they're super stretched out. Well, not super stretched out, but you know, they're a lot more, they're a lot bigger than what they were, put it that way instead. So if you want big spots in your, or big spots of color at least, in your end result, you don't actually necessarily need to make big spots when you start off. Yeah, I'm actually just going to take this whole edge off. Bugs me. Okay. So that's pretty well done. And I'm going to pick this up. And once again, I'm just going to run this through my pasta machine. Okay, here you can see what I mean, how much these green and yellow spots have stretched out. I mean, they were a lot smaller than this when we started. Something else that's sometimes quite nice to add into this veneer before you put the translucent over the top is a bit of now I've forgotten how to speak. I will remember in a minute. Gold leaf, there we go, gold leaf or silver leaf or even copper leaf. I mean, it would be, it's really pretty and it's really quite sparkly, so it's amazing. Right, so cutters. So I have my graduated circle cutters here, and I'm gonna get 3 different sizes, I think. Those should do nicely. Although I might leave this one out and get a smaller one, which is somewhere on my desk, but I need to find it first. There we go. So this is just a brass tube from one of my pen kits that is really nice to use as a cutter. So now I'm going to do the same thing, but instead of shredding it up with just little tears, little dots, I'm actually going to, I'm going to just punch out little circles, starting with my biggest one, and I'm just going to randomly cut out a bunch of these. Okay, and some of the tiny ones. And of course you can use the little in-between bits, you know, to make something else that has a completely different look. So you may need a backing for that. Okay, so I'm just going to grab some scrap clay, and I'll get some green because this veneer is going to be green. And hopefully I can get bits. So like I mentioned in the past, there's no such thing really as scrap clay. So all of the little cane bits that you get that get cut off, or if you didn't want to use this in a project or anything like that, just put it in a pile. I have tons and tons of piles actually, so this is just one of them. And I just have that sort of close at hand, and when I feel like I need, you know, a bead core or a backing to something, or you know, some filler clay, basically what I do is I grab I go into my scrap pile and I grab a bunch of that, so that I'm not using, you know, fresh out of the packet clay that I could use for a project, but rather using these let's call them pre-mixed bits. So now for this version of my watercolor technique, or shred and stick, although strictly speaking this one wasn't shredded, I'm going to place my circles randomly on this, overlapping slightly, so you can do this with squares or triangles, or you know, if you have some Kemper cutters, which I don't, you know, you can use those little shapy ones, that sort of thing. So I've actually put two of the circles on top of each other, so that actually makes a really cool effect as well. But I'm just placing them randomly about. I'm not too concerned with where they go. Put you over there. Turns out I might need some more small ones. Okay, and while we're at it, I'll just put these off to the side here. And because I've used a green backing, if there are any gaps or spots that I might have missed when covering with my little ink veneer, it doesn't matter, like it won't show up very clearly. Okay, that's a teeny tiny one. Just gonna move this in front of me, go away, and then I will grab my acrylic roller again. I'm just gonna flatten this out. This first one. So when you're using an acrylic roller on this, you want to try and get it from sort of all different angles and not just, you know, in one direction, so that you don't distort it, like that you don't make, if I was just to roll it this way, I might get bulges on the top and on the bottom, and so I can counteract that by rolling it this way after that. Oopsies. I might actually put this through the pasta machine, I think, because it's tedious. folded it. That's fabulous. Okay, so you can see instead of having these shredded edges, this one has more controlled, rounder edges. But the drawback of this one is that you don't get quite as much of the black coming through. I mean, I'm sure you could if you practiced with it, but I can't. And I like the look of that one more anyway. So I think that's that for this part of today's 2-week challenge video. If you have any questions or comments or anything like that, please let me know, either in the video chat here or on any of my social media platforms, and I'll be happy to get back to you. So I will be back on in 10 or 20 minutes or so and just have music playing, but I'll be, you know, still playing with my clay. So if you want to join me for that, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow night at 8 p.m, hopefully, if the NBN plays along. And tomorrow's theme is fishy canes, which are some of my favorite canes to make. They were really the ones that got me started on complex caning, so hopefully you'll join me for that. And so until then, bye.